So, Danielle, can you say hello?
Hi everyone. Wonderful to be here. Thanks again for having me. So I think we will just dive in if that works. Well, it's just really, really inspirational to be here today with so many women impact leaders, talking about our careers, what we've learned along the way in our journeys as executives, as managers, as leaders, and how we continue to persevere and do good work. And today, what I wanted to do was really share my story about resilience and culture. So I'm Danielle Conkling, and I'm the head of sustainability at First Citizens Bank. As some of you may know the bank as the one who acquired Silicon Valley Bank last year. So we'll just, if we can just go to the next slide. So, just by way of introduction, I've not had the typical career path as a sustainability leader. I started my career over 25 years ago at two of the largest global financial institutions, Citi and JP Morgan. I was an investment banker, then a private banker, and then had roles in strategy at Bain and at SVB. And in all of these roles, really had the opportunity to work with some of the most interesting companies in the world, some of the most influential and wealthiest families. And it was really my experience advising people and organizations on how they can make a meaningful impact through planning and philanthropy and building strategy and programs that led me to take a bit of a leap of faith um, and pivot to corporate responsibility and specifically sustainability and ESG at SVB. And these are really topics and activities that excited me the most. Really lucky um, to have taken the career turn that I did. And never in a million years would I have ever expected myself, when I look back in my career, to be in the role I'm in today. But I simply seized an opportunity to do something that I loved, and I made it my full-time gig, which is great. So just the next slide. So just, kind of thinking about my role and bringing it back a few years. In 2018, SVB's corporate responsibility program was very much focused on regulatory compliance with the Community Reinvestment Act. It was mostly donations and volunteering and just a few of the larger applicable markets. And at the time, the concept of ESG and sustainability were new, but increasingly a topic of interest to our shareholders, our customers, our employees. We didn't have an ESG team, nor did we have a sustainability program, but we had a lot of elements of it throughout our organization. We had the CRA program, climate tech lending and renewable energy project financing, and a growing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We hadn't really put structure or framework around it, and we certainly had programmatic gaps and very little and probably inconsistent communications. But I saw the possibilities, and our executives asked my team to explore what this might look like for our organization. Very similar to, I think, what a lot of companies were doing at the time. And so, with really little direction and resources, I learned everything I could and made a case to pilot ESG 1.0. It took, really years and a lot of education and program building, but through a lot of stops and starts and incremental steps, we not only had, a carbon footprint for our organization and a global philanthropy and community kind of impact strategy, really engaging over 80% of our employees and benefiting many of our communities that we operate in. But we actually set bold targets and goals and demonstrated commitment to ESG in our reports and integrated them into how we operate and do business. And, we made real impact and we became known for it at SVB. But it wasn't easy all the time, but it felt natural because it was already part of our DNA. and we really simply needed to put infrastructure and investment behind it. And 5 years later, and 40 years after SVB's founding, my team was, getting ready for our newest ESG report, and about to announce we had surpassed 2 billion of our $5 billion sustainable finance goal in just 1 year into our 5-year commitment. And we were already thinking about what's next for us, and how our commitment to sustainability and ESG was fueling innovation and growth and impact where it mattered, and it was really a win for a lot of people. Um, and so, but then, if we go to the next slide, um, a combination of many things, including interest rate hikes and an economic slowdown in venture capital and tech, and a duration mismatch in how we manage our treasury portfolio and social media, resulted in, I think, what became known as the first Twitter-fueled bank run, and the collapse of the bank. And that broke my heart, because the company that I came to love, and call home was no longer. The important work that I did was over, and I worried about who's going to fuel innovation for a better world. We finance the majority of climate innovation, minority founders, and life-changing solutions like the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. And while all that was happening, apparently some politicians decided to seize the moment, and make it yet another kind of political spectacle. And, the headlines are saying ESG caused the bank failure, which I assure you it did not. And we knew that, of course, but it hurt, right? Like things were kind of falling apart. But luckily, the spectacle didn't last long, and kind of became a bit of a joke, and it lost traction very quickly. And, I look back at that now and I think about, oh my gosh, like as a leader, like what did that feel like when kind of everything felt like it was falling apart? And I think back now. And so if we go to the next slide, um, I remember thinking, well, what now? I went from kind of being in denial and angry and sad to finally accepting things, but there was a lot of uncertainty still. And I was scared. I was scared because I had no idea what my future held. Um, but I knew deep in my heart that my work was still important and that I needed to find a home to keep doing the good work that I've been doing, right? I changed my career and fell in love with this work. So what was simultaneously inspiring for me was seeing my SVB colleagues in the trenches fighting to keep the bank alive. And I decided to join them because it was clear that we had something special and people wanted us to survive and keep going. And we were going to keep fueling innovation for a better world because that's who we were, even if it was under the FDIC and whomever. And then if we go to the next slide, it was really after 17 excruciatingly uncertain days that First Citizens Bank, a smaller regional bank in North Carolina, acquired us through the FDIC bank auction. And they decided not only to purchase SVB's profitable and growing loans and assets, but to retain its people and the wonderful things that made it special, including our sustainability team and the work that we were doing. And, never in a million years, of course, would I have ever thought that a Southern family-controlled bank would buy a hip Silicon Valley bank, known for its progressive culture and focus on impact, but they did. And they've given me that opportunity to build sustainability and ESG for the entire bank and keep fueling innovation for a better world. And so I'm grateful for that. And so when I think about resilience and culture, as I reflect back on the last couple of years, if we go to the next slide, just, some of my reflections here was, many of my colleagues, many of them are still with us, over 80% of them, and many of them keep coming back. And I know that the fact I'm still at SVB or First Citizens is one of the reasons um, that a lot of our colleagues kept going and have stayed because not so much because of Danielle, but if I'm here, then so is sustainability and the values and impact that they stand for. And that culture and that commitment of the individuals that made SVB, what I realized is that it really transcended beyond the legal entities and the physical walls of the organization. Um, People stayed because it was like in their hearts. They really believed in what they did. And we've brought that to First Citizens and they recognize how special that is. And that's why we're here. And it wasn't easy the last year or so, but I'm really lucky that we had each other. We stayed true to who we were, sticking together, leveraging our successes, kind of seizing on those opportunities, um, one day at a time, staying really grateful. But it allowed us to do this, and living those values kind of carried us through that difficult time. And I mean, I think that's, one of the things that's um, really inspired me. And people always ask me, like, wow, you're still there. Like, why? And so many good reasons that I've shared with you. And so that is what I wanted to share today. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think there
Well,
might
thank
be
you
a
so much,
few.
Danielle, for
Yeah.
sharing that story, and also maybe answering some of the questions that we didn't know about about the bank transition. We appreciate it.
Yeah,
So I'm going to
absolutely.
go and just a reminder, please keep those questions coming. All right, this one came in. You spoke about sustainability at the beginning of your presentation, and Felicia says, "What is the first step in beginning a program, especially with no budget?"
That's a really good question. And that's where a lot of companies start. And so when I think about when I started the pilot, I mean, we were a little different because we weren't a startup. We were a pretty large company with resources. But, um, you know, a lot of what we did and what others have done are pretty similar in the sense that a lot of times it is really starting with taking stock of um, what is most material to your organization. So, we call it a materiality assessment when we think about ES&G and looking at, well, what are the things, is it your carbon footprint? Like there are table stakes, right? Like everybody needs to now have a carbon footprint. You need to disclose that, especially for operating in the state of California. But it really, every business and every industry and really every company, ESG is very, very broad. And so what ESG is for a manufacturing company, it's going to look different from a professional services company. That's going to look very, very different from, a tech company. And so really understanding what are the things that most impact your business. It could be privacy. It could be consumer safety. It could be things like water. It could be like a lot of different things. And so I think first identifying that a lot of companies will work with, consultant. There's all kinds of consultants. There are big four firms, and then there are smaller consulting firms. There are now a lot of kind of templated ways to do this. And a lot of it is really about kind of coming to a point where you kind of know what you need to focus on and starting to develop a strategy and a plan for it. And a lot of that is about education and stakeholder engagement throughout the organization and really understanding what is it that you need to focus on and what elements of sustainability and ESG do you really already have in the organization. To the point I was making, we already had different programs. So what we had to do is stitch it together, but it also gave us an opportunity to look at where our gaps were and really think about, what is it that we're investing in? What is it that we do really well? What is it we could do better in? What don't we have at all? And looking at that relative to the material areas for our business. And so a lot of times it is, and sometimes you start as one person and eventually you grow your team. Um, but a lot of that has to do with getting the organization on board and understanding what it is. Hopefully that helps. with that
Yeah, thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
Our
Okay.
next question is, our company is going through a tough time, I guess. And how did you learn to manage employees? And also, how did you know what to tell them, I guess, or maybe communicate to them during these tough times?
That's a really good question. So, when I go back to some of those darker days when even when just kind of the bank run had happened and the FDIC came in, it was like we didn't know a lot, right? Because things were happening so quickly, and so even the executives were kind of, leaving one by one, and people were coming in, first the FDIC, and then of course the acquirer a few weeks later. Um, what I did with our team is we met every day. We met every day, even if we didn't have an update to say, we don't have an update, this is what we know, but also to just check in on people, to check in with people and see how they're feeling, and to also just keep them busy. Because I think a lot of it is, if there were a lot of projects that we knew we could still wrap up and that we could still continue, even if we didn't know where the company was going. There were projects, consulting work that we had paid for. We knew we wanted to wrap it up, at least have the data, because if we got acquired, there were certain things that would have to be passed on to either the regulator or to the acquirer. So in a sense, keeping busy and focusing on what you did know and have control over, kind of kept us going. And I think that was really, really helpful. I think also just staying close. I mean, I retain my entire team. So we are all still here, because of that. And that the team that we had the that day when, on March 10th, is still very much the team that we have. And I think that in the end, our team decided that we didn't know what was going to be on the other end of things, but that we had this unique opportunity to learn from it. Because how often does this kind of thing happen, right? How often do you get to learn and lead, um, in chaos or through difficulty? And I think, thinking about crisis, um, and the opportunities that afford, it doesn't always feel good, but usually don't get that. And I think because we stuck together, and we were able to help each other through that, I think we're a resilient team, but we're also a very close team, and we have a lot of respect for one another. So I think when I think about what I told them, I told them the truth. I told them to look for a job because I couldn't guarantee anything. Um, and I'm still amazed that they're still here. So aside from contractors, like all my full-time employees, um, stayed.
Oh,
And
that's
then
wonderful.
well, I mean, I would not have guessed that was going to happen. And who knows? People find jobs, things happen, right? You never know. I
Right.
mean, I think, there's job markets and things like that are factors as well. Um, but yeah.
Well, thank you. All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. And everyone, Danielle's going to join us for the panel in a little bit. So thank you so much. All right, so for our final question from Helena is, was the culture of the new company different, and how did you learn to adapt?
So that's a really good question. I would say that from the outside and from the surface, you could say, yeah, it was different, right? Like I said, kind of in my presentation, you know, it was a Southern bank in South Carolina that got started in agriculture banking. And there was us at Silicon Valley Bank, the bank to the venture capitalists and innovation companies. And you would look at that and be like, it couldn't be any more different, right? And I think, at the outset, people kind of, naturally went into it with those assumptions. And what I have learned over the last year and a half, since we've come together, is that we're actually more similar than not. So one thing that I think I realized is, in the beginning, I was like, oh God, like a lot of us were like, well, why couldn't, a big bank acquire us, or, somebody we're more familiar with, right? It was more fear of the unknown. And I look back now, we could have gone gobbled up by one of those big banks that I used to work for, and they would have taken what they had would have taken and spit us the rest of it out, right? And this company, like I said, retained most of its our employees and most of the clients. And big part of that was because we didn't have a lot of overlap. And they had a lot of just like respect and understood the value of our organization. And what they did know is that we grew our business well and we took care of our clients. And that's how they thought about their business. They were long-term thinkers that invested in their communities, and they took care of their customers first and foremost. And when I think about culture, um, that is what's really important, and finding that commonality. Just because we live in different parts of the country, just because we got our start differently doesn't, but in the end, our values were the same. And I think we've learned that over time. And I now think back, because at the time it was chaos. I think the day that um, the FDIC, the auction happened, and then it was announced that First Citizens was purchasing us, and many of us didn't know who they were. It was really interesting because I remember the next day, a few First Citizens leaders came in, flew to California and met with us, and I remember them coming to the office, and the first thing they did was introducing themselves, and they asked us, "How are you doing? We can't even imagine what you've got." That to me, it was about culture. And so I think about that as a leader. It was just like it was very human. And I think that's why there's so many of us still there.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your story. So, before we move to Juanita's presentation, do you have any final words of wisdom on this topic?
Yeah, just that I mean, as women, as leaders, I think you don't always get these opportunities to learn in such a meaningful way, but there are always these little things that happen. And I think, um, I think there's something special about the people that you're surrounded by. It was friends and leaders and a lot of women um, who, I kind of know through my networks who came and really supported me and my colleagues through all of this. And I think about, that resiliency is that, you have it in yourself, but a lot of that resiliency you get from the people around you, and that you don't have to lead on your all by yourself. That part of being a leader is, leading with others and asking for help and for support when you need it.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time and wonderful thoughts this afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.